Hey, Eric, can I get a mic check for you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the Design and Construction Requirements of the Fair Housing Act, Technical Overview, Part 1. This training is approximately an hour and a half in length. The GoToWebinar platform viewing screen. Under the GoToWebinar platform, you will find several dashboard items. This includes the viewing screen. At the top, it will state whose screen you are viewing, allow you to zoom in or screenshot the items you see on the screen. The webcam function should be disabled. The GoToWebinar dashboard and control panel. You can set up the dashboard to include the screen that is being shared and the GoToWebinar control panel. Or you can move it to another window if you have multiple screens. The GoToWebinar control panel. The GoToWebinar control panel is where you will control your audio, review any attached handouts, and ask any questions. Today, we have 3 handouts in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. These handouts include the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, the Fair Housing Design Manual, and the Participant Workbook. The GoToWebinar Knowledge Check questions. During the webinar, we will be conducting knowledge checks. The GoToWebinar calls these quick polls. When we launch the polls, they will automatically appear. To select your answer, click the circle next to the answer and hit submit at the bottom. GoToWebinar certificate. For attending at least 45 minutes of today's presentation, you will receive an attendance certificate. If you attend for less than 45 minutes, you will not receive an attendance certificate. The attendance certificate will be sent to you on Wednesday. If you take the final quiz, which will be available at the end of today's presentation, and pass the quiz, you will receive a passing certificate. The final quiz was in the reminder emails and will be in the email that comes to participants 2 hours after the end of the webinar. You may take the quiz anytime following this training, and passing certificates will be immediately issued for a score of 80% or higher. Agenda, topics, and learning objectives. Today's agenda includes an introduction, topics, and learning objectives to help you understand the design and construction specifications of the Fair Housing Act requirements 1 and 2. During this session, we will cover the following topics and learning objectives. Our terminal learning objective, or TLO, is to identify the Fair Housing Act design and construction requirements and technical guidance provided in requirements 1 and 2. Our topics in enabling learning objectives, or ELOs, are as follows. Topic 1, FHA overview. ELO, identify the intent of the Fair Housing Act's disability rights protections. Topic 2, requirement 1, an accessible building entrance on an accessible route. ELO, identify the design and construction specifications of FHA requirement 1. Topic 3, entrances. ELO, identify the guidance provided for FHA compliant entrances on an accessible route. Topic 4, site and practicality test. ELO, recognize the purpose of site and practicality testing and the results that affect site accessibility. Topic 5, requirement 2, accessible and usable public and common use areas. ELO, identify the design and construction specifications of FHA requirement 2. And then our live question and answer session will follow. We'll have our knowledge check review. We'll close the training for the day, and you'll be able to take your final quiz. Now, this training relies on the provisions of the Fair Housing Act and its regulations, the accessibility guidelines, and the supplemental questions and answers, the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, ANSI, A117.1, 1986, and the Fair Housing Act Design Manual for the guidance that it provides about compliance with the technical, design, and construction requirements in the Act. Presenters. Today's presenters include Mr. Eric Contreras, Mr. Michael Dyson, and I am Crystal Nolan. Mr. Contreras has 20 years of experience performing accessibility consulting services, Americans with Disability Act or ADA compliance evaluations, implementation plan development, ADA corporate policy guidance and interpretation, and ADA compliance reviews. During the live Q&A session, Mr. Contreras will answer your questions, which you can type in the questions pod. Mr. Dyson has several years of experience facilitating webinars, workshops, and live events, and looks forward to assisting with this training. And my name is Crystal Nolan. I have worked in education, media, and advocacy for over 20 years, and I am also pleased to assist with today's training. Technical support and questions. Ms. Corey Nolan and Ms. Alexia Brown will provide technical support today. Ms. Liz Dyson will organize your questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation, which Mr. Contreras will answer. The Fair Housing Accessibility First program provides a design and construction resource center, also known as the DCRC, which is staffed Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern. The DCRC provides comprehensive and detailed instructions, helpful online web resources, and an information line for technical guidance and support. You can reach the DCRC toll-free at 888-341-7781. Or you can reach the DCRC at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. And with that, we'll move into topic 1, FHA overview. FHA history. In 1968, Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act was enacted, also referred to as the Fair Housing Act or the FHA. The legislation prohibited discrimination in public and private housing, which made housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin a violation of the law. In 1988, Congress amended FHA coverage to prohibit discriminatory housing practices based on familial status and disability. This made it unlawful to deny the rental or sale of a dwelling unit to a person because that person has a disability. As a protected class, people with disabilities are unique in at least one respect. They are the only group that can be discriminated against solely by the design of the built environment. The law provides that a failure to design and construct certain multifamily dwellings to include certain features of accessible design will be regarded as unlawful discrimination. For more information about the protections of the FHA, scan this QR code or visit HUD's website. FHA safe harbors. The FHA does not establish a single accessibility standard. Architects, designers, and builders must choose a standard that provides a safe harbor for building projects. A safe harbor is a recognized objective standard that, if followed without deviation, ensures compliance with the FHA's design and construction requirements. There are 15 HUD-approved safe harbors. For a list of HUD-approved safe harbors, scan the QR code on the screen or visit the Frequently Asked Questions page on HUD's website. Seven requirements. The intent of the FHA is realized by the 7 requirements of the guidelines, which establish minimal levels of accessibility. The guidelines provide detailed technical design and construction specifications and clarify the areas of multifamily developments with accessibility obligations. Today's overview focuses on the technical specifications in Requirement 1, accessible building entrance on an accessible route, and Requirement 2, accessible and usable public and common use areas. The next training session, Technical Overview Part 2, will explore requirements 3 through 7, and that will be held on Tuesday, May the 21st, 2024. Well, with that, Michael, we are at Knowledge Check 1, so I'm going to send it over to you.
Thank you, Crystal. For our first knowledge check, a failure to build FHA multifamily dwellings with certain accessible features is regarded as unlawful discrimination. First option is true, second option is false. So go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, a failure to build FHA multifamily dwellings with certain accessible features is regarded as unlawful discrimination? The first option is true. The second option is false. All right, we'll give a few more moments to get your selections in. All right, I'll go ahead and close this poll. Thank you so much. And back to you, Crystal, with the key takeaways.
Thank you, Michael. In 1968, Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act was enacted, which made housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin a violation of the law. And in 1988, FHA coverage was amended to prohibit housing discrimination based on familial status and disability. The FHA provides that a failure to design and construct certain multifamily dwellings to include certain features of accessible design will be regarded as unlawful discrimination. A safe harbor is a recognized objective standard that, if followed without deviation, ensures compliance with the FHA. The 7 requirements of the guidelines clarify the areas of multifamily developments with accessibility obligations. That brings us to topic 2, requirement 1, an accessible building entrance on an accessible route. Requirement 1 specifies that covered multifamily dwelling units must have at least one building entrance on an accessible route unless it is impractical to create an accessible route to the entrance. An accessible route is, in part, a continuous pedestrian path with no steps, no abrupt changes in level, and no steep slopes. It is the key element that allows people with mobility disabilities to travel around a site or a building and enter, use, and enjoy features that are available to all residents. And now we've reached knowledge check 2. Michael?
Thanks, Crystal. For the second knowledge check, an accessible route is, in part, a continuous pedestrian path with no steps, no abrupt changes in level, and no steep slopes. First option is true. The second option is false. So let's go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, an accessible route is, in part, a continuous pedestrian path with no steps, no abrupt changes in level, and no steep slopes. First option is true, and the second option is false. All right, we'll give a few more moments for selections to be put in. All right, I'm going to close this. Thank you so much. And back to you, Crystal.
Thank you, Michael. Now we're going to talk about ANSI specifications. Specifications for accessible routes may be found in ANSI 4.3 accessible route. Some of the general specifications for an accessible route are a 36-inch minimum width. ANSI gives additional specifications to apply when accessible routes go around obstructions. The second general specification is a maximum running slope of an accessible route is 1 to 20. Slopes greater than 1 to 20, up to 1 to 12 are allowed, but they must comply with the ramp provisions in ANSI. And the third specification, cross slopes may not exceed 1 to 50, which is approximately 1/4 of an inch per foot, which is 1 to 48. Now, let's discuss the ANSI specifications for an accessible route in more detail. Running slopes on walks must not exceed 1 to 20. A slope of percent unless the walk is designed as a ramp, in which case the maximum slope may be 1 to 12. Ramps must have railings on both sides if it has a rise greater than 6 inches or a horizontal projection greater than 72 inches. In other words, if the walk is to go up 1 foot or 12 inches in height, it needs to be at least 240 inches or 20 feet long. People using wheelchairs cannot effectively use walks with steep slopes. Now, cross slopes. Cross slopes on sidewalks must not exceed 1 to 50, which is approximately 1/4 inch per foot. This limits a sidewalk from slanting from side to side. Too large a cross slope could cause a wheelchair user to lean too far to one side or the other, or even cause a wheelchair to tip over. This standard also helps prevent people who use crutches from losing their balance. Required walks must be made of a stable and firm material, not gravel or mulch. And lastly, accessible routes must be designed for safe passage for persons using wheelchairs and persons with other types of disabilities. Accessible routes to amenities and areas. Within a building site containing FHA covered dwelling units, amenities and common use areas must be accessible and on an accessible route. Examples include, but are not limited to, mailbox kiosk, manager's offices, laundry facilities, trash disposal areas, observation decks and terraces, including those located on rooftops, swimming pools, playgrounds, and clubhouses, fitness rooms, and office centers. Level elevated walkways. A level elevated walkway is an effective and attractive solution to connect uphill pedestrian arrival areas with the ground floors of covered buildings. And that brings us to knowledge check 3. Get your way.
Thanks, Crystal. For the third knowledge check, within a building containing covered dwelling units, blank areas must be on an accessible route. First option, security control. Second option, utility control. And the third option, common use. So go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, within a building containing covered dwelling units, blank areas must be on an accessible route. First option, security control. Second option, utility control. And the third option, common use. I'm going to give a few more moments to get your selections in. All right, thank you so much. Going to go ahead and close this poll. And back to you, Crystal.
Thank you. Pedestrian and vehicular routes. Ideally, people with disabilities should be able to travel throughout the complex using an accessible pedestrian route. However, there may be situations where an accessible pedestrian route is impractical because of factors beyond the owner's control. On such sites, the guidelines allow access via a vehicular route in lieu of an accessible pedestrian route. This means it may be necessary for a person with a disability to drive from a building to reach public and common use spaces. In rare cases, access to common areas vehicular route is permissible when an accessible pedestrian route is impractical if there are factors beyond the control of the owner, such as a finished grade exceeding 8.33%, natural or man-made physical barriers, or legal restrictions, any of which prevent the installation of an accessible pedestrian route. On sites that meet the above conditions for providing access by a vehicular route, there must be accessible parking spaces and curb cuts at each facility or amenity that cannot otherwise be reached on an accessible pedestrian route. For instance, a multifamily development has a basketball court on a hill toward the rear of the property. Now, since the hill is too steep for a pedestrian route, that a wheelchair user can safely navigate, a vehicular route may be used to access this amenity. Key takeaways. Requirement 1 specifies that covered multifamily dwelling units must have at least one building entrance on an accessible route unless it is impractical. An accessible route is, in part, a continuous pedestrian path with no steps, no abrupt changes in level, and no steep slopes. Specifications for accessible routes may be found in ANSI 4.3 Accessible Route. Within a building containing covered dwelling units, common use areas must be on an accessible route. In rare cases, access by a vehicular route when an accessible pedestrian route is impractical is permissible only if certain factors apply. And that brings us to top entrances. And more specifically, accessible entrances. All FHA covered multifamily buildings must have accessible entrances. Entrances required to be accessible are easy for people with disabilities to use. Detailed specifications to achieve this are found in applicable sections of ANSI 4.13 doors. When dwellings have individual separate entries, only the common use exterior side of the unit entrance must comply with ANSI. However, both sides of the entrance door must meet applicable ANSI specifications at common building entrances. And that brings us to our fourth knowledge check. Michael.
Thanks, Crystal. The fourth knowledge check, ANSI 4.13 doors, contains detailed specifications for entrances required to be blank. The first option, usable. The second option, accessible. And the third option, operable. So go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, ANSI 4.13 doors contains detailed specifications for entrances required to be blank. The first option, usable. The second option, accessible. The third option, operable. All right, we'll give a few more moments to get your selections in. All right, go ahead and close this poll. Thank you so much. And back to you, Crystal.
Thanks again, Michael. Common entrances and a single ground floor. When a building has more than one common entrance, but only one ground floor, at least one of the entrances must be accessible. The accessible entrance must be the primary entrance and be on an accessible route connecting all ground floor units. The accessible route must connect the building entrance to a pedestrian arrival point. If the pedestrian arrival point is a parking lot, as shown in the example on the screen, the accessible route must connect the parking spaces and the access aisles with the building entrance. Buildings with multiple ground floors. When vehicular arrival points are established at the entrance to a building, the level of the building served by that entrance is considered a ground floor. The guidelines define a ground floor as the floor of a building with a building entrance on an accessible route. A building may have one or more ground floors. Breezeway buildings. Breezeway buildings have a common entrance, except that the entrance and the interior corridor are open to the elements. When a breezeway serving a cluster of covered dwellings has more than one entrance, at least one must be accessible. Individual entrances. When a building has ground floor units, each with its own exterior entrance, each must have an accessible entrance on an accessible route. Units over non-residential uses. Single-story units located over a common garage or other non-residential use spaces, such as retail shops, must be on an accessible route. Most buildings of this type incorporate an elevator to provide an accessible route. And here we are again, time to check the knowledge. Michael, I'm sending it back to you.
Thanks, Crystal. For the fifth knowledge check, in a building with only one ground floor, the primary entry and accessible route must connect all ground floor units. First option is yes. The second option is no. So go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, in a building with only one ground floor, the primary entry and accessible route must connect all ground floor units. The first option is yes, and the second option is no. All right, a few more moments to get your selections in. All right, go ahead and close this poll. Thank you so much. And back to you, Crystal, for the key takeaways.
Thank you again, Michael. ANSI 4.13, doors, contains detailed specifications for entrances required to be accessible. When a building has more than one common entrance, but only one ground floor, the primary entrance must be on an accessible route connecting all ground floor units. The accessible route must connect the building entrance to a pedestrian arrival point. And if the pedestrian arrival point is a parking lot, the accessible route must connect parking spaces and access aisles with the building entrance. When vehicular arrival points are established at the entrance to a building, the level of the building served by that entrance is considered a ground floor. And our next topic, 4, site impracticality test. Site impracticality test, terrain. The guidelines, provide tests to determine site impracticality. The tests provided in the guidelines are intended to be applied during the early design phases. Claims of site impracticality should always be substantiated by evidence tabulated during the application of the appropriate test. Now, there are some cases where site impracticality is not allowed. Buildings with 1 or more elevators cannot claim site impracticality. Buildings where an elevator is provided solely as a means of access on a ground floor cannot claim site impracticality. And buildings that have an elevated walkway. Now, there are 2 tests for determining site impracticality due to steep or difficult terrain. And those tests are, the first is the individual building test, which analyzes the grade difference between the undisturbed site and planned site building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. The site analysis test analyzes the site as a whole to establish the minimum number of units that must be made accessible. Determining which test to apply depends upon the type and the number of buildings that are planned for a site. Okay, let's look at some examples. Single non-elevator building with 1 common entrance. A site with 1 non-elevator building and only 1 common entrance into the building may only be analyzed using the individual building test. If the site is found impractical, no units are covered. Single non-elevator building with more than 1 common entrance. A site with only 1 non-elevator building, but more than 1 common entrance may be analyzed using either the individual building test or the site analysis test. Regardless of which test is used, a minimum of 20% of the planned ground floor units must be on an accessible route and meet the guidelines. This 20% is a starting point. After the test is applied, in most cases, more units must comply. Multiple non-elevator buildings, each with more than one entrance, a site with several non-elevator buildings, each with more than one entrance, may also be analyzed using either test. Again, regardless of which test is used, the minimum 20% of the planned ground floor units must be on an accessible route and meet the guidelines. The 20% is a starting point. After the tests are applied, in most cases, more units must comply. Individual building test, step A. Use individual building test is a two-step process. In step A, the slope of the existing grade elevation must be made from the center of the planned entrance or door to all vehicular or pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet. Once you've done that, you're going to proceed to step B. In step B, the slope calculation must be made from the center of the planned entrance at the planned finished grade elevation to all vehicular or pedestrian arrival points, again within 50 feet. At this point in the design process, the finished floor elevations established to prepare a grading plan should be considered preliminary. If both the slope in step A and step B exceed 10%, then it is considered impractical to provide an accessible route to the building or dwelling unit entrance. And now we are at knowledge check 6. Michael?
Thanks, Crystal. For the sixth knowledge check, the individual building test analyzes the grade difference between planned building entrances and pedestrian blank. First option, crosswalks. Second option, arrival points. And the third option, cross slopes. So we'll go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, the individual building test analyzes the grade difference between planned building entrances and pedestrian blank. First option, crosswalks. Second option, arrival points. And the third option, cross slopes. All right, give a few more moments to get your answers in. All right, go ahead and close this poll. Thank you so much. And go back to you, Crystal.
Thank you, Michael. Site analysis test, 3-step process. The site analysis test is a 3-step test that requires a pre-design analysis of the entire site to determine a minimum number of units that must be on an accessible route and meet the other accessibility requirements in the guidelines. Now, site analysis test, step A. During step A, First, a survey map of the site's topography is prepared. Second, the total buildable area is calculated. And third, the then buildable area with slopes less than 10% is calculated. Buildable area is that portion of the site where buildings may be legally built. And that excludes non-buildable areas such as building setback areas, utility easements, etc. The percentage of total buildable area of the undisturbed site with a natural grade less than 10% is calculated by dividing the area with the slope less than 10% by the total buildable area. Step B determines the minimum number of ground floor units that must meet the guideline. The minimum number of ground floor units that must be made accessible must equal the percentage of buildable area with slopes less than 10% calculated in step A. The accuracy of the slope analysis in steps A and B must be certified by a surveyor, engineer, or another qualified professional. For example, if the area on a site with slopes less than 10% is 100,000 square feet, and it is divided by the total buildable area of 125,000 square feet, the result is 80%, which is the minimum percentage of units that must be accessible. This is only a minimum threshold. More units may be required to be accessible. This determination is made in step C. Site analysis test, step C. When conducting step C, designers must review the site plan again during the design process to determine if additional ground floor units must be added to the minimum number established in step B. A preliminary site plan must be prepared with the minimum number of units designated. An additional review of the grade differences of the final design is then calculated at the remaining units between the planned entrance and the pedestrian arrival point. If additional accessible routes and entrances are created, the number of covered accessible units will increase. Whenever accessible routes or entrances have been created to provide access to the minimum required number of units, any additional units that those entrances may serve must also meet the guidelines requirements. If the grade is 8.33% or 1 to 12 or less, then units must be added to the minimum number of covered units. Site impracticality due to unusual site characteristics. It may be impractical to provide an accessible route on certain sites where a law or a regulation requires the lowest finished floor or other structural member to be raised to a specific level above the base floor evaluation. Examples of such sites are those located in federally designated floodplains or coastal high hazard areas, where buildings again must be raised to a specific level above the base flood elevation. Unusual site terrain. On a site with unusual characteristics, it is impractical to provide an accessible route to a building entrance only if both of the following conditions occur. Now, the first condition is there is a 30-inch difference in finished grade elevation measured between the lowest permissible structure of the planned entrance and all vehicular pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet. If there are no pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet of the planned entrance, the measurement must be made between the lowest allowed planned entrance and the closest pedestrian arrival point. And the second condition, the slope between the lowest permissible planned entrance and all pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet exceeds 10%. Likewise, if there are no pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet of the planned entrance, the measurement must be made between the lowest allowed planned entrance and the closest pedestrian arrival point. And Michael, it's time for our 7th knowledge check.
Thanks, Crystal. For the 7th knowledge check, the site analysis test analyzes the grade difference between the undisturbed site and the planned site building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. First option is true, second option is false. So we'll go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, the site analysis test analyzes the grade difference between the undisturbed site and planned site building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. First option is true, second option is false. All right, give a few more moments to get selections in. All right, go ahead and close this poll. Thank you so much. And back to you, Crystal, for the key takeaways.
Thank you again. Key takeaways. The individual building test analyzes the grade difference between the undisturbed site and planned site building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. The site analysis test analyzes the site as a whole to establish the minimum number of units that must be made accessible. And with that, we're going to move into topic 5. Requirement 2. FHA requirement 2 specifies that public and common use areas be accessible to people with disabilities, permitting them access to and use of amenities. The guidelines reference the 1986 ANSI A117.1 standard as the technical specifications to follow when designing accessible public and common use areas. Other accessibility standards may be followed, but they must be as accessible as the ANSI standard 1986. While minimal levels of accessibility are specified in the guidelines for dwelling interiors, and those are requirements 3 through 7, high levels of accessibility are achieved in the public and common use areas due to the application of ANSI. This makes sense because public and common use areas are most likely to serve people with disabilities. And that brings us to knowledge check 8. Michael, I'm going to send it over to you again.
Thanks, Crystal. The 8th knowledge check reads, the guidelines reference the blank standard when designing accessible public and common use areas. The first option, 1986 ANSI A117.1. Second option, 1968 IBC A177.1. And the third option, 2019 ICC 594.6. So we'll go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, the guidelines reference the blank standard when designing accessible public and common use areas. The first option, 1986 ANSI A117.1. Second option, 1968 IBC A177.1. And the third option, 2019 ICC 594.6. So give a few more moments to get those selections in. All right, go ahead and close this poll. Thank you so much, and go back to you, Crystal.
Thank you, Michael. So our next section deals with minimum parking requirements. In the provisions of requirement 2, minimal levels of accessible parking are established. For residents, 2% of parking spaces serving covered dwelling units, and upon request by persons with disabilities are mandated. A minimum of 1 accessible space at each site facility where parking is provided, such as a swimming pool, a mail kiosk, a clubhouse, or recreational facilities are expected. For visitors, if visitor parking is provided, a sufficient number of spaces to provide access to grade level entrances of covered multifamily dwellings must be provided, and a minimum of 1 at sales or rental offices. A sufficient number can be established by examining the total number of visitor parking spaces provided compared to the size of a project. A 1 space minimum for accessible parking is required, but more should be provided if a large amount of visitor parking has been provided for the benefit of residents. Parking facilities. When a development provides multiple types of parking, such as carports, detached garages, covered parking within buildings containing dwelling units, or etc., accessible parking must be provided on the same terms and range of choices offered to other residents. At least one of each type must be made accessible. Accessible parking spaces. The minimum specification in the ANSI standard for an accessible parking space is a 96-inch wide parking space and a 60-inch access aisle. The width of the space and the access aisle help ensure that people using the space have enough room to unload a wheelchair and get out of a vehicle safely. Accessible parking spaces serving a public leasing office or other facility open to the public within a multifamily project may also be subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. In these cases, van accessible parking is required with a 96-inch access aisle. The complete standard for a van accessible parking space can be found in the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. Most versions of the ICC A117.1 standards, and many other safe harbor documents. Restrooms. A restroom in a public area must meet all the applicable sections of the ANSI standard 4.22, including providing compliant maneuvering space and grab bars. Specifications for sinks. Sinks in restrooms must have knee space, pipe protection, and usable faucet handles, such as lever style. Soap and paper towel dispensers and mirrors must be mounted at a usable height and within reach ranges specified in ANSI. Accessible routes to recreational facilities. When multiple amenities, such as tennis courts, playgrounds, or spas, are provided within the same development, the guidelines stipulate that not all, but a sufficient number of each type must be accessible. The number of facilities determined to be sufficient must ensure an equitable opportunity for use by people. It is recommended that all recreational facilities be accessible where the site is relatively flat, and this can be easily achieved. Accessible swimming pools. Access must be provided to the pool area when there is a swimming pool. The guidelines do not require an accessible route by way of a ramp or a lift into the pool water. Presently, the U.S. Access Board has published standards for access to pools. So it is recommended that you reference the U.S. Access Board's standards for pools. And now we have reached Knowledge Check 9. I'm going to send it back to Michael.
Thanks, Crystal. For the 9th knowledge check, Builders Inc. has designed and constructed site amenities covered by the FHA. There is no accessible route to the pool area. Is this an FHA violation? First option is yes. Second option is no. So go ahead and launch this poll. And again, this reads, Builders Inc. has designed and constructed site amenities covered by the FHA. There is no accessible route to the pool area. Is this an FHA violation? All right, give it a few more moments to get your selections in. All right, go ahead and close this poll. Thank you so much. And back to you, Crystal.
Thanks again. Accessible routes within recreation area. The routes and areas around recreation, craft, or lounge areas must be accessible. When there are tables, counters, or work surfaces, one of each type must be accessible and have knee space. Accessible water fountains. If drinking fountains are provided, at least 50% must be accessible with knee space and other features specified in ANSI. Accessible laundry facilities. Laundry facilities must be on an accessible route. Although front-loading washing machines are not required, adequate maneuvering space must be provided so a person who uses a wheelchair can approach and pull up close to use the machine. And however, upon request, management must provide mechanical reachers so a seated person can reach into a top-loading machine. Accessible mailboxes. Mailboxes must be within reach ranges established in ANSI. Although typically not all the boxes provided serve covered dwellings, all the mailboxes serving covered dwelling units must be placed within reach range. No higher than 54 inches for a side reach or 48 inches for a forward reach, and no lower than 9 inches for a side reach and 15 inches for a forward reach. This will ensure that regardless of the installed mailbox system or the established numbering system, that mailboxes serving ground floor dwellings will be accessible. Accessible trash facilities. Trash dumpsters are a common use facility, and a sufficient number on the site must be on an accessible route. Although not required, dumpsters can be recessed into the ground and equipped with lightweight, easy lift lids. If enclosures are built around dumpsters, there must be an accessible entrance into the enclosure leading to the door or the opening of the dumpster. And with that, we find ourselves at knowledge check 10. Michael?
Thanks, Crystal. For the final knowledge check, there are 4 water fountains in a recreation room on an FHA dwelling site. How many must be accessible? First option, only 1. Second option, 2. Third option, 3. And the fourth option, all 4. So go ahead and launch this last poll. And again, this reads, there are 4 water fountains in a recreation room on an FHA dwelling site. How many must be accessible? The first option, only 1. Second option, 2. The third option, 3. And the fourth option, all 4. All right, we'll give it a few more moments to get your selections in. All right, go ahead and close this poll. Thank you so much. And back to you, Crystal, for the key takeaways.
Thank you. FHA Requirement 2 specifies that public and common use areas be accessible to people with disabilities. The guidelines reference the 1986 ANSI A117.1 standard when designing accessible public and common use areas. In Requirement 2, minimal levels of accessible parking for residents and visitors are established. The minimum specification in the ANSI standard for an accessible parking space is a 96-inch wide parking space with a 60-inch access aisle. A restroom in a public area must meet all applicable sections of the ANSI standard 4.22. Sinks in restrooms must have knee space, pipe protection, and usable faucet handles. It is recommended that all recreational facilities be accessible when the site is relatively flat. When there is a swimming pool, access must be provided to the pool area. The routes and areas around recreation, craft, or lounge areas must be accessible. If water fountains are provided, at least 50% must be accessible with knee space and other features specified in ANSI. Laundry facilities must be on an accessible route. Mailboxes must be within reach ranges established in ANSI. A sufficient number of trash dumpsters must be on an accessible route. And at this time, we will move to the questions that have come in during today's training event. And we'll have Mr. Contreras answer those questions. Okay, Eric, there's a question from Drew, and the question is, are there any specifics that cover access to fitness centers and fitness center equipment?
Thank you for that, Crystal. The Fair Housing Act requires that public use and common use areas be accessible for persons with disabilities. A sufficient number of amenities, but not less than one, must be accessible for persons with disabilities. That said, there must be an accessible route throughout the fitness center, and it must connect with at least one of each type of equipment, such as an elliptical, treadmill, row machine, etc. It must be on an accessible route and must provide a 30-inch by 48-inch clear flow space at the equipment.
Thank you for that answer. We have another question from Tom, and this is on dumpsters. The enclosure of dumpsters is 100% accessible, while a sufficient number of individual dumpsters need to be accessible, right? I.e., the enclosure is accessible, but the dumpsters in the enclosure may not all be accessible.
So again, with the same consideration that under the Fair Housing Act, the public use and common use areas must be accessible, and that a sufficient number of amenities must be accessible. So the gate that leads to the dumpster enclosure should be accessible, as it is part of that public use and common use area, but the not all dumpsters are going to be required to be accessible, and the dumpster itself also, there are no specific requirements for that.
Okay, we have another question, and thank you for that answer, Eric. We have another question from John, and the question is, if a private developer of multiple townhomes building development denies a very short or dwarf-like person a lower of a step bar counter rather than having it on level countertop, does the owner have any recourse?
So it is important to keep in mind that townhomes are usually not covered by the Fair Housing Act. It would be important to know, for example, the construction date, if it has more than 4 units, if the building has an elevator, and in the case that it is covered, this could be addressed through potentially a reasonable accommodation or modification of the premise, and that would probably be the best way to address this. But if they have more information about this question, they can certainly submit it by email, and we would be happy to address their concern.
Wonderful, thank you for that, Eric. We have another question from Kelly. If providing parking with EV chargers Will a minimum of one accessible space be required for FHA compliance?
Regarding this, the Fair Housing Act stipulates that 2% of the parking spaces serving covered dwelling units must be accessible, and they must be on an accessible route. If different types of parking are offered, such as surface parking, garage, or covered parking spaces are provided, a sufficient number of each type must be made accessible. An electric vehicle charging station is not explicitly covered under the Fair Housing Act materials. So the guidelines for the manual do not provide specific guidance on this because it didn't exist at that time. But the electric vehicle charging station should be treated as an amenity and not as a type of parking. So at least one electric vehicle charging station should be accessible. That is, it should be on an accessible route. It should have a 30-inch by 48-inch clear floor space for a wheelchair user, and it should have operable parts that are located within accessible reach ranges. Now, in addition, if they want more information for how to comply, they can also refer to the Access Board's guidance on EV chargers, and that is found at the Access Board's website.
Thank you again for that answer. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Madi would like to know, in a multifamily dwelling site covered under FHA where multiple, 4 or more, attached single-story dwelling units, each unit with its own individual entrance, are constructed in a row or cluster, do site and practicality tests apply? If yes, which test would be applicable?
So I guess the short answer would be yes. The site and practicality test applies to sites containing multiple buildings with 4 or more multifamily dwellings. As the site has multiple buildings, either the individual building test or the site analysis test may be used to determine site impracticality. If applying the individual building test, it will be necessary to apply the test for each building in the site. And it is important to keep in mind that site impracticality exceptions apply only in rare cases where there are significant topographical challenges. And even in these cases, there will never be a condition where less than 20% of the units are required to comply with the guidelines. In most cases, when applying the test, the outcome is that a much larger percentage of units than the 20% minimum will be required to comply.
Thank you for that answer, Eric. And I think we have time for just one more question. Jeff would like to know, does fair housing design have standards that regulate handrail extensions on ramps? For example, in ADA 505.10, exception 3, in existing situations, it's better to turn the extensions than to have them run straight out into the existing sidewalks. Could this be a hazardous situation?
So the Fair Housing Act Design Manual stipulates that the handrail extensions provide support and guidance, and it refers to the ANSI standard, which stipulates that they should be in the direction of the ramp. This is briefly illustrated in the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, page 2.17. However, the Fair Housing Act Design Manual does not contain references to alterations as it applies during the design and construction of new multifamily buildings containing covered dwelling units. But you can refer to the safe harbor if you select a safe harbor such as ANSI A117.1 2009. Section 505.10 contains the same exception as the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Thank you, Eric, for those answers. We don't have time for any more questions, but if you did not have the chance to have your question answered during the live Q&A, please email that question to us at the DCRC. Now I'm going to return it back to Michael, and we're going to review the knowledge checks.
Thanks, Crystal. So now we will go through the knowledge check answers, starting with the first one. A failure to build FHA multifamily dwellings with certain accessible features is regarded as unlawful discrimination? And the answer to this was the first option. This is true, and 98% of you got this one correct. Moving on to knowledge check 2. An accessible route is, in part, a continuous pedestrian path with no steps, no abrupt changes in level, and no steep slopes. And the correct answer for this is the first option. This is also true. And 100% of you got this one correct. Moving on to knowledge check 3. Within a building containing covered dwelling units, and the correct answer was the third option, common use areas must be on an accessible route. And 98% of you got this one correct. Moving on to knowledge check 4. ANSI 4.13 doors contains detailed specifications for entrances required to be, and the correct answer was the second option, accessible. And 93% of you got this one correct. Moving on to knowledge check 5. In a building with only one ground floor, the primary entry and accessible route must connect all ground floor units. And the correct answer was the first option. This is true. And 100% of you got this one correct. Moving on to knowledge check 6. The individual building test analyzes the grade difference between planned building entrances and pedestrian, and the correct answer was the second option, arrival points. And 94% of you got this one correct. Moving on to knowledge check 7. A site analysis test compares grade differences of the undisturbed site, planned building entrances, and pedestrian arrival points. And the correct answer for this was the second option. This is actually false. And 27% of you got this one correct. Moving on to knowledge check 8. The guidelines reference, the correct answer was the first option, the 1986 ANSI A117.1 standard when designing accessible public and common use areas. And 100% of you got this one correct. Moving on to knowledge check 9. Builders Inc. has constructed a site covered by the FHA. There is no access to the pool area. Is this an FHA violation? The correct answer for this is the first option, yes. 98% of you got this one correct. Moving on to our final knowledge check. There are 4 water fountains in a recreation room on an FHA dwelling site. How many must be accessible? And the correct answer for this was the second option. 2 water fountains need to be accessible on an FHA dwelling site. And 77% of you got this one correct. So good job on the knowledge check questions. Now I'll pass it back over to Crystal for the closing.
Thank you, Michael. Certificates. For attending at least 45 minutes of today's presentation, you will receive an attendance certificate. If you attended for less than 45 minutes, you will not receive an attendance certificate. The attendance certificate will be sent to you on Wednesday. If you do not receive the attendance certificate by Thursday morning, please check your junk or spam email. And if it's not there, email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. If you take the final quiz and pass the quiz, you will receive a passing certificate. The final quiz will be in the email that comes to participants 2 hours after the end of the webinar. Quizzes may be taken anytime following the training event, and certificates of passing are automatically issued when a passing score of 80% is achieved. If you do not receive your passing quiz certificate by Friday evening, please check your junk or spam email, and if it's not there, please email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. Training evaluation. At the end of this training, there is a training event survey for you to complete. We appreciate your responses and support in improving our training products. Contacts. Please contact us with further questions via the DCRC by calling 888-341-7781. That number is accessible by voice or teletypewriter. Or email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. You can also scan the QR code on the screen to add the DCRC's contact information to your telephone's address book. Please mark your calendar and join us for the next training session, Technical Overview Part 2, which will explore requirements 3 through 7 on Tuesday, May the 21st. I would like to thank today's presenters, the technical staff, the ASL interpreters, and of course, you, the attendees. Again, we thank you. The information that you see on the screen will remain available for the next 20 seconds to give you time to screenshot or scan the QR code. And we hope that you have a fantastic day. Thank you again.